Well, hello class, this is Professor Prof Levy, and I'm here in the beautiful and historic city of Boston, Massachusetts. We're recording a video of the American Revolution, and we're here at the actual site of the Boston Massacre. That's right, people were actually killed right here on this site. And we've been spending some time walking through the events that led up to what is going to be the American Revolution. The building behind me is the town hall where the governor of Massachusetts would meet, and that's why it was partly an epicenter for the protest. What I want you to recall is that the main events took place on March 4th, 1770. So normally we think of this as a cause of the American Revolution. But independence isn't declared until 6 years later, 1776. So we have a tendency to compress events in time, and also we have the advantage of hindsight. Looking back, we know that this event is going to be a cause of the American Revolution. However, when it happened, at that time, the British called it the Boston Incident. Paul Revere called it the Boston Massacre. So two different perspectives on the same event. What I want you to appreciate also is that in 1770, it was a much smaller city, but a very urban and compact city. Notice how small the streets were. These were nothing more than donkey carts paths at the time. So it's very crowded, congested area. This was the main political center of the government of Boston, located right here in comparison to the capital that you see today. And it was strategic because it was right across from the customs house. I get the cameraman to slowly pan to the Bank of America, very relevant today, that is still a place of commerce or banks. And if you could further get a shot of the harbor, now you can see how the ships would come into the harbor. They would be unloaded. In a moment we'll go to Boston Harbor where the Boston Tea Party took place. But when the cargo for the ships were unloaded, they would be put into warehouses. And that's what the guard was doing there that night. He was standing out there guarding the warehouse. And so it was, again, it was still winter. We happened to be here in the summer, but there was one guard out on the evening of the 5th, and there was still snow on the ground. The people of Boston had already been complaining about the various taxes, starting with the tea tax of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765. And they were complaining about those acts, and as they gathered here that night, there were altercations between the protesters and the British soldiers. Great Britain, which had won the 7-Year War, which we call the French and Indian War in the United States because there weren't many French soldiers stationed in the United States, but they had Indian allies who were fighting on their side. So we call it the French and Indian War. In any event, Britain won that war, but the war went on for at least 7 years, and it was very expensive, very costly. So at the end of the war, the British decided that to pay off the debt caused by the 7-Year War, they would increase revenue and taxes on the colonies. Their rationale was that the war in North America was fought to protect the American colonies from falling into French possession. And so therefore they expected that the American colonists would be grateful and thankful for British support and protection. The Americans felt that this was a war caused by Britain and France, having very little to do with the American colonists, and so therefore they shouldn't be expected to pay the cost of that war through higher taxes. Also, they felt that they didn't benefit from the French and Indian War. The war that concluded that, the Treaty of Paris that you read about, really established a proclamation line in 1763, promising the Indians in particular who supported the French that the American colonies would not continue to grow and expand into Indian territory. That's why the Indians stopped supporting the French, and without Indian support, the French really lost the battles in North America. So the American colonists felt, well, if you're going to have that proclamation line of 1673, and the colonies wouldn't be able to get any bigger, then what do we get out of the French and Indian War? We didn't get any land, but we got taxes that we have to pay for. So they were very unhappy with it. The British response, which is very important to this uprising, because we can look back from a perspective and say, could it have been avoided? Could there have been other alternatives? And we can see all of these events escalating tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain. But Britain's response to the American grievances, many of which were legitimate and could have been resolved, but the way the British responded was by sending in more soldiers. And so as those soldiers began to reside here in Boston, tensions between local people and British soldiers escalated. Because the British soldiers were paid so poorly, many of them found jobs working on the docks. They would be moonlighting. And that again creates competition and tension between local dock workers, people in this area, and the British soldiers who are harassing and also taking jobs in the dock area. So on that particular night, March 5th, there was one soldier standing out here guarding the warehouse, and a group of protesters, they had been protesting for several days. Some of them were leaving taverns and coming out and protesting. The Lone Guard called for other British soldiers to support him, and they claimed that the crowd here that night was throwing snowballs, oyster shells, and rocks at the British soldiers. And then, when a group of them had gathered here and shots were fired, 5 protesters were killed right here on this spot. The first one to die was an African American named Crispus Attucks. He was an escaped slave who had come to Boston, was living as a free man, working here on the docks. And after this, Paul Revere did his own diagram of the shooting. And this is the picture that you see in your textbooks and on many murals where it looks like it was broad daylight. It looks like the Americans were lined up against the wall and the British opened fire at point blank range under command. In fact, no officer gave orders to fire. It was a shooting. And following this shooting, there was a trial. There was an investigation. And during the trial, which is interesting that the British hired an American lawyer to defend the British soldiers. And the lawyer who defended them at the trial was none other than John Adams, who was a prominent Massachusetts lawyer, would become the second president of the United States, and would join the Revolutionary Corps later. But in 1770, he defended what took place here. And he said the British soldiers were justified in opening fire. They said they were confronted by a mob of unruly and drunk protesters, that they were harassing the officers and throwing snowballs, and so therefore the officers had the right to open fire. Also pointing out that the leaders of the American Revolution didn't send those people here that night. They weren't sent here by Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and John Adams. It was a spontaneous gathering of protesters. Incidentally, his cousin Sam Adams, who owned the tavern, was part of the instigators, so even within that family having that. And the other thing I want you to remember is the words that he used at the trial. John Adams called the people who were gathered here that night a rabble of saucy boys, sauce meaning drinking, they were drunk. A group of mulattoes, which are referring to people like Crispus Attucks, black and mixed race people, and Irish thieves. This was a derogatory term for Irish people and Irish immigrants, saying that the crowd that night were not the respectable, upstanding people of Boston, but they were a mixed group of protesters, and therefore the officers were justified in shooting them down. What I want you to think about today as we look at this event is how similar it was to controversial shootings that we see in America today, where you have law enforcement officers or police officers, and there's a shooting of unarmed people, and how we react to that. In 1770, the Americans sympathized with the protesters and said they are the people who really represent the spirit of America, and it is the British officers who are oppressive and discriminating against colonists. A growing separate identity, although technically they're all British, they felt that they don't treat us the same, those who live in America, as colonists in Great Britain. And so this would continue to escalate. 3 years later, in that same harbor behind you would be the Boston Tea Party, where it would go a step further. And then protesters would not only protest non-violently, but they would board the ships, and 3 ships, and through the tea, in today's value, worth over $3 million worth of tea into the harbor. And it's going to escalate from there, finally with shots being fired in 1775 at the battles of Lexington and Concord. Hope to take you there before we leave Boston. But we're going to conclude now. Hope you're enjoying the course. Take care and be well.